Good afternoon. And first of all, I would like to thank Drs. Johansson and Cardona for inviting me to participate in this year's 99 NICU. I'm delighted to be back. I have been here before, and for those of you who have not been to Copenhagen and are not from Denmark, make sure you get there. It's really as beautiful as on this picture, so I'm delighted to be back. I'm also grateful for the opportunity this afternoon to discuss with all of you how we can use a count of 3 common neonatal morbidities to help us select high-risk, these are all high-risk infants, but to help us select the most high-risk infants for long-term follow-up. Now, you're all clinicians, I suspect, in the room, so I don't need to tell you that the birth of a very preterm infant is a harrowing experience for most parents. Suddenly, a future that seemed predictable becomes uncertain. And although many very immature children grow up to be healthy and happy, just like these 2 beautiful twins, we all know that the risks of an adverse childhood outcome are far greater than in full-term infants. I've brought along some data from the UK Epicure studies, and to just remind us of the magnitude of the problem, this particular graph shows you that infants who in this national cohort study were born at 24 weeks, of those, only 4 to 5 of every, at 24 weeks, only 4 to 5 out of every 10 survived, and among the survivors, half had moderate to severe disability. Now, I grant you that time has moved on and your outcomes may be somewhat better than these, especially in the Scandinavian countries, but the odds are still frightening of some things not going as well as one would hope. So parents still, wherever they are, of such immature infants, ask themselves and us agonizing questions. Will my baby survive? Will he walk and talk? Will she be able to learn and succeed at school? Now, the oracle of the Greek god Apollo in the city of Delphi was the fortune teller of ancient times. People came from all over Europe and Asia Minor to ask questions about their future. Neonatal intensive care, of course, had not yet been invented. Otherwise, I'm sure Apollo's priestess at this temple would have had to field questions from anxious parents about the future of their frail and tiny infants. But as health professionals, we are supposed to be rational users of scientific data, not fortune tellers. So how can we predict the future early on of a very immature infant with reasonable accuracy? Now, numerous teams of investigators over the years have shown that the prediction of disability is inaccurate at birth and even during the entire first week of life. This is a fact. Mortality is relatively easy to predict using certain scoring systems, but disability not so much. There's very poor precision, online calculators notwithstanding. Prediction of disability improves throughout the stay in the neonatal NICU. And this is not because you're getting a few weeks closer to the actual outcome. No, this is because the morbidities that the babies may acquire or may not in the neonatal ICU are very important determinants of the ultimate outcome. Now, if you're like many of the colleagues I know, you are particularly worried if your patients develop any one of these particular morbidities. Brain injury, by which we mean the nasty things we see on ultrasound or other types of imaging, such as bad bleeds or holes in the brain or big ventricles for any reasons. Severe retinopathy of prematurity, that is pretty much retinopathy that requires treatment, and bronchopulmonary dysplasia. And we fear these morbidities. We fear others too, and we'll get to that in the talk later on. But we fear those because arguably they have been most consistently and repeatedly associated, correlated with adverse childhood outcomes. Again, I'm using, because they are national cohort data, Epicure data to just show us the relative frequencies, not so much the absolute. You know, the Epicure babies were particularly immature, 25 weeks gestation or less. So in the center, you can see BPD. On your right, brain injury, basically, and on the left, treated retinopathy. And the black bar refers to the first cohort in 1995, and the white bar to the more recent cohort in 2006. Anyway, in any cohort, Epicure is no exception. Of these three morbidities, BPD will be the most common. And you can also see, and this is also pretty much repeated and confirmed in other cohorts, we haven't made much progress in this regard with respect to BPD. It remains a stubborn obstacle for these babies, and we haven't made much inroads. So in any cohort, BPD will be the most common. Severe retinopathy of prematurity and brain injury, less common, but far from rare. So these, I should go back for a moment and say something that is really important. I had said before, these morbidities are significantly correlated with adverse outcome. That is one truth. But the other truth is that they are individually only modest predictors, all of them. People always surprised when I say that includes severe brain injury, because there's still, in 2019, the sort of notion that this is doom and gloom, the way it was when we first learned about these lesions in the late 1970s and early 80s. Individually, these morbidities are modest predictors, and most babies who leave the neonatal ICU with a single morbidity have a good prognosis. But we also know that some of our patients acquire more than one of these morbidities. Strangely, this is a fact that has been ignored by many of the previous investigators into the prognostic impact of these morbidities. They've always been looked in, taking a cohort and saying BPD is predictive in this way, severe retinopathy is predictive in this way, ignoring the fact whether they were single morbidities or combinations. So quite some time ago by now, 15 years to be precise, we decided to take it one step further and also ask not only what are the individual correlations of the individual morbidities, but what do they do in combination. And we used the inception cohort that we had assembled for this trial of indomethacin prophylaxis in preterms to address these questions. And this paper, as I said, is by now 15 years old. I'll run very quickly through the main results, but we will then take it one step further. So we picked, I also should say, these three morbidities after careful literature review at the time, and identified these three morbidities as the most promising in terms of their predictive ability. So it's important that you understand that we didn't do the typical prediction model. There's nothing wrong with it, but we took a different approach. We didn't take the more typical approach where people throw a bunch of likely variables into the model and then see what comes out the other end. So it was always a priori just these three, based on prior knowledge. And just to show you very quickly what we found in terms of the prevalence in this cohort, this was a cohort of extremely low birth weight infants. Everybody was under a kilo birth weight. They were very sick. They got into this study in the first day of life, and here's the frequencies. They're quite high, but again, the relative frequencies are exactly what you saw for the Epicure study and what you will see in any other cohort. The outcome was the primary outcome in this trial, which was death or disability at a corrected age of 18 months, and disability, as is often done at that age, defined as one or more problems in the following 4 domains: motor function, cognition, hearing, and vision. The only thing that was different from the actual primary outcome of the trial was that the death component in the composite was only death after postmenstrual age of 36 weeks, so only children who survived up to that age were included, for the obvious reason that if you die early in your neonatal ICU course, you cannot develop some of these morbidities, chiefly BPD and severe retinopathy. So it was only the children who survived long enough to actually be able to develop these morbidities. So let me quickly show you in the next couple of slides what we found for children who had none of these 3 morbidities. So the observed rate of death or disability at 18 months was 18%, and you can see for yourself what it is for BPD alone, 38%, right through to severe retinopathy alone, 50%. Now in the next slide, I'm showing you all the possible combinations of these 3 morbidities, and at the bottom of the slide, the observed rate of adverse outcome if a child developed all 3. And I think, without reciting the numbers for you that you could read yourselves, you will see very quickly the powerful impact of having multiple morbidities compared to what we saw for the single morbidities. So our senior statistician, Professor Robin Roberts at the Neonatal Trials Group at McMaster University in Canada, used logistic function regression to show that each of these morbidities was significantly correlated with the outcome at 18 months. But as I told you, that's why we picked them. That wasn't really news at all. That was just confirmation of what many others had shown before us. But Robin's next observation were novel at the time, and we believe, at least, and I hope after this presentation you will agree with me on that, important for the management and counseling of our patients and their families. Because Robin observed 2 other things. Number one, that each of these morbidities predicted the outcome in a similar magnitude, and I'll show you that in a moment. So the predictive value, if you will, was in the similar size. And also very important, the 3 morbidities predicted the outcome completely independently of one another. And these 2 observations, similar predictive value and statistically independently from one another, allowed Robin to develop a very simple model that is basically just counting how many of these morbidities a child has. Here's a table from the original publication. And if you look at the numbers just inside the red frame, you can see that the odds ratios for the individual morbidities range from 2.4, there's obviously always a confidence interval around it, to 3.7 for brain injury. That is, in statistical terms, similar. You know, it's not 2.4 and 8 would be quite different. And you can see at the bottom that the morbidity count odds ratio, so the odds ratio for adding each morbidity is 2.9. Now, if you're like me, you actually digest figures better than such dense tables. And I'll show you first, before we get to the figure, very quickly how well this model performed, at least in this particular cohort. So here you have in the center row the observed rates of the poor outcome, and then in the right-hand column what the morbidity count would have predicted. And now I'm going to show you the figure that I promised just a few seconds ago. Again, a figure from the original publication, which actually I can tell you that because I've tried it many times, parents understand if you want to use it. if you explain it well and if you want to use it in any counseling or question session. So along the y-axis here, we have the probability of the poor outcome, which in this case is our outcome at 18 months. Along the x-axis, the numbers of these 3 morbidities ranging from 0 to 3. The dashed horizontal line at 35% is the average rate for the entire cohort. There were 910 extremely low birth weight babies in this particular study who survived to 36 weeks from the original 1,200 TIPP participants. The solid circles are the observed rates of the adverse outcome at each of the morbidity counts with a 95% confidence interval. So you can see, having none of these morbidities, obviously your risk isn't 0. It never is, but there are other reasons for having an adverse outcome. But it is substantially below the average rate of 35% that you would maybe otherwise quote to parents. So that's reassuring. Having one of these morbidities doubles that risk essentially in this cohort. Having 2 triples it, and you can see by the time you have all 3, the prognosis is a bit concerning indeed. So from this now 15-year-old, that's how you age, from this now 15-year-old data, we concluded that in this group of extremely low birth weight infants, a simple count of the presence of or absence of these morbidities was certainly adding to our ability to predict adverse outcome at 18 months. Now, I told you that we got to this stage by doing a literature research and zeroing in on these 3 morbidities. But I think you have every right to say, well, what about infection? Haven't we learned that infection is bad for neurodevelopment? And you're absolutely right. Infection has also been shown. Barbara Stoll and the Neonatal Research Network in the US, particularly prominent in this area, has been shown to increase the risk of neurodevelopmental impairment. So in a subsequent ancillary analysis, we asked exactly that question. What is the role, the added role of infection for the use of this morbidity count model? Should infection be a 4th partner, perhaps? And again, we used the same cohort in which we had developed the original morbidity count model. Infection, in this case, I can show you on the next slide. On the left-hand side, we looked at 4 types. These were obviously prospectively collected data from the trial records. So we had culture-proven sepsis. This was culture for anything, not just bacteria, but also viruses and fungi. Culture-proven meningitis, necrotizing enterocolitis stages 2 and 3, and then we also had the variable any of these, any infection. And as you now move over to what you see again in the red frame, you look at these odds ratios and you can see we're down at 1.3, 1.4, 1.6. There's only one exception, and that is meningitis with an odds ratio at 4. So 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 is really now quite a bit lower. It's basically only half the size of the odds ratio that we had for the lowest of the other 3, which was BPD. So as a statistician, Robin Roberts said that does not make infection an equal partner in the morbidity count model. Well, why didn't we add meningitis? We didn't add meningitis because, at least in this cohort, I don't know what it's like in your unit, it was thankfully, very rare. Only 2% of these children actually had culture-proven meningitis. So, concluding from this ancillary analysis, we found that yes, neonatal, you saw that on the side as well. Everything is significant. Everything jumps over the arbitrary hurdle of 0.05, except for necrotizing enterocolitis, I guess. So neonatal infection does increase the risk of a late death or survival with impairment, but it seems to be a weaker predictor of poor outcome than BPD, brain injury, and severe retinopathy of prematurity. Obviously, that does not mean that we have a license to be casual about infection. It does, anything we can do to reduce risk is obviously imperative to do, and preventing infection remains a very important goal. And the most obvious strategies, of course, include meticulous hand hygiene and judicious use of antibiotics. So far, I've told you, though, about analyses that we've done 10 or more years ago. So you might say, well, hasn't she got anything new to tell us? So we did do one more step in trying to sort of firm up this morbidity count model as a useful tool, not just in the TIPP cohort, but for this next analysis, we used a completely different cohort of very preterm infants, namely the cohort we had assembled for the CAP trial, the Caffeine for Apnea of Prematurity trial. And we published that analysis just a few years ago in the Journal of Pediatrics. On this occasion, as you can see from the title of the paper already, we used also a completely different age at outcome, and therefore a different outcome, namely impairment at age 5 years, which was one of the phases of follow-up in the CAP trial. We had an 18-month follow-up too, but we wanted to be as different as we possibly could be from what we had done in the TIPP study. So basically, we went about this wanting to, it's always good to validate something in a new cohort, so that was part of our intent here. Starting out the same way we did with the TIPP study cohort, what was the prevalence of these morbidities in this particular cohort? If you remember the numbers from TIPP, you can see that they are slightly lower. BPD, though, very close, but the others are clearly lower. That's good and that's right, not only because a few years had passed, but also in order to get into this trial, you could be a little more mature, a little less sick, and bigger than the eligibility criteria for the TIPP study. So this is a slightly more mature and healthier cohort than the TIPP study cohort. The size is good. At the bottom you can see that 1,500, over 1,500 very low birth weight infants, you had to be below 1,250 grams to get into CAP, formed the cohort for this analysis. What was the outcome? Well, again, it was the same outcome that was the main outcome for the 5-year follow-up, composite of death or disability, except again, we limited it to the children who survived to 36 weeks for the obvious reasons. BPD and severe retinopathy don't show up early. The outcomes, the domains at 5 years, again, motor function, cognition, hearing, and vision, but we had added for the 5-year also abnormal behavior, which is another of the disabilities that our very preterm babies can develop, like disabling behavior, and also a general health component. And I will not go in as much detail to this analysis, in the interest of time, and also to not be so repetitive, because it was all remarkably similar to what we found in TIPP. And I'm just going to take you right to where it matters, namely the graphical depiction of the relationship of this morbidity count to the outcome, in this case at 5 years, and you can see that the relationship holds up very nicely. That means, of course, that before we could generate this figure, we had confirmed that the morbidity count, that each of these morbidities was again significantly correlated with the outcome independently from one another. And again, the odds ratios were of similar size, so they could be combined in a simple count, having 0, having 1, having 2, having 3. If you go across and try to read off the absolute risk, or the probability of an adverse outcome, of course it will not be giving you the same numbers as for TIPP, because it depends on the baseline risk. So the absolute risks will vary, but the relationship will stay the same. That 2 is much worse than 1, 1 is worse than none, and so forth. So this is a figure that is not actually published anywhere, but I'm showing it to you because I think it's of interest that we actually asked ourselves at one point, does this morbidity count model hold up equally well in boys and girls? And you can see it does. But again, what we just discussed, absolute risks are not always the same, of course. So you see that at every morbidity count, from 0 right through to 3, the girls have lower risks of adverse outcomes than the boys. And that should surprise nobody in this hall, because any unbiased sample of immature children followed through into childhood will show the same phenomenon. The girls will outperform the boys. They have lower risks. We took the analysis one step further with this cohort at 5 years and asked ourselves, what is the relationship between the morbidity count and each component of the composite, not just the composite outcome by itself. And you have to believe me or go back to the paper, because I'm not showing all of it to you, but each component of this component, whether it was behavior or vision or hearing, every component was significantly correlated with the morbidity count. And I'm going to show you the actual data just for the 2 most common types of impairment. First, motor impairment. And just these are just observed rates here, just to make it easy for you to see the impact without cluttering up the picture with confidence intervals. But you can see that if you left the neonatal ICU, if you were a CAP trial baby, with none of these 3 morbidities, BPD, brain injury, severe retinopathy, you had only a 1% on average risk of having a motor impairment at 5 years. If you had any one of these, you had a 3% risk, confirming what I said at the outset. Having a single one of these morbidities is definitely not the end of the world. Having 2, now your risk has gone up of having just a motor impairment. You could have other things too, of 11%. And you can see the impact when you have all 3, a third of the children actually had a motor impairment. And that's significant gross motor impairment at 5 years with the gross motor function level of 2 or higher. And you can see very much the same relationship for cognitive impairment. You can see the numbers for yourselves. And cognitive impairment at 5 years was defined as a general IQ on the Wechsler test below 70. So that's significant cognitive impairment, less than 2 standard deviations below the mean. So from this last set of analyses, I think we can safely conclude that in these very low birth weight infants who made up the CAP trial cohort, this count really held up and helps predict outcome even as late as 5 years. So we now believe that we have validated this model of simply, looking at how many of these morbidities are present in this child. Each of these 3 morbidities multiplies the odds of a poor outcome, whichever way you define it, by a constant amount. That's basically the important bottom line. And this constant amount by which the odds are multiplied by adding yet another morbidity, we call the incremental odds ratio. The incremental odds ratio for the TIPP cohort was 2.9. For the CAP trial cohort, it was 2.4. The confidence limits are shown at the bottom. We believe, and I put it to you, that these odds ratios in 2 different cohorts are remarkably similar, considering that the types of preterm babies in the cohorts were really quite different. Their prevalence of some of these morbidities was quite different. The age at follow-up was totally different, and therefore also the definition and prevalence of impairment at follow-up was different, and yet the model held up. So how can we make use of this model in our practice? I've already told you there are different applications. I told you about actually taking the graph to parents in the NICU who had that level of interest and asked probing questions. to help them. This is not about withdrawal of care or something like that necessarily, and certainly is far too late for that in most cases when it becomes reliable, but just to give them some guidance about where things might go. So that's one option, but I think the other is that it really, for those of you who are involved in follow-up of these high-risk kids, I think it really helps. And I know several follow-up programs, certainly in Canada, who are making use of this. Now, ideally, of course, these are all at-risk babies, and you would follow up them all into early childhood, but local resources may not allow that to happen everywhere. So if you have to make some choices, I think we can safely say now that babies who are discharged with 2 of these morbidities or all 3 definitely deserve close and prolonged follow-up, because their risk is so much greater than what you would think is the average risk of this population in your unit. And because other colleagues have shown that high quality early intervention programs really do make a difference, we would also recommend that they be referred to early intervention programs, although that's obviously not tested, that this has been used as a sort of referral base. So before we get into discussion and your questions surrounding this, I just want to end with a round of credits and thanks. First and foremost, of course, to the children and their families who participated in these 2 international trials. Our neonatal trials group, which was our data center for all these trials at McMaster in Canada, all of our colleagues and their staff in many different countries and parts of the world who collaborated, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, MRC, which brought the bulk of the funding, but also we had some help from MRC Australia and the National Institute of Child Health in the US. And with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.